Hi, everyone, and welcome to the UNESCO-PUCP Lectures on Gender Equality. Hola a todos, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos a las clases magistrales de igualdad de género. Les quería comentar que abajo hay un botón donde dice Interpretation, y ahí pueden poner el idioma en el que quieren que esté. Si quieren pueden poner el audio original, English o Spanish. Y si ponen Spanish, debajo sale Mute Original Audio. Entonces pueden mutear para que no se escuche doble. Y a continuación voy a hablar en inglés y toda la conferencia va a ser en inglés. Okay, so hi again, everyone. I was just telling people that if you need the translation, there is an interpretation button below. So if by any chance I am speaking in Spanish and you are an English speaker, you can press Spanish or English. So I wanted to welcome Talia Bettcher. She's our keynote and amazing speaker. She's going to give the talk, Transphobia, Intimacy, and Abuse. Talia Mae Bettcher is a professor of philosophy at California State University, LA. Some of her articles include Evil Deceivers and Make Believers, Transphobic Violence and the Politics of Illusion, Trapped in the Wrong Body, Rethinking Trans Oppression and Resistance, What is Trans Philosophy? And she's currently completing the monograph Intimacy and Illusion, an essay in trans philosophy. So I want to welcome Talia. I want to thank her so much for being here with us. We're truly privileged and honored to have her with us tonight. And I want to mention that it's going to be 1 hour for the conference, and then we're going to have like 55 minutes for the Q&A. You can write your question on the chat in Spanish or English, and we can help with the translation. So without further ado, I want to welcome Talia. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. And Aranza, thank you again for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here and to be speaking to you. So I'm gonna share a screen of a little PowerPoint. So I want to start with a little bit of review. I mentioned to you last time, this is a series about trans oppression, and specifically about what I call reality enforcement. The previous talk was basically the beginning. Next week will be the end, and today is the middle. So last time, I began by talking a little bit about trans philosophy and what it was for me to approach things trans philosophically. We spent our time talking about terminology, trans terminology, and difficulties around really trying to frame trans identities in terms of those terminologies. When you have things, the deployment of terminology that is local, that changes over time, even at a time, meaning being contested. We also talked a little bit about notions like sex, gender, gender identity, gender presentation, and so forth. And we talked about misgendering specifically. And then I introduced what I call reality enforcement, and I spent some time introducing it towards the end. I suspect that because, I don't know about you, but towards the end of a talk, I start to zone out. So, you know, and that's just normal. I want to make sure that we're on the same page when I talk about reality enforcement, because it's like a key concept for me. And so I want to begin by reviewing that. And then today, sort of the agenda is, I want to talk about the concept of intersectionality, the intersectionality of multiple oppressions. And I want to think about that in terms of reality enforcement. And then you may recall the expression calamities of intimacy. If you don't, I'll explain it again in due course. This connects very much to my discussion on intersectionality. We'll talk about that. And then finally, I want to conclude by talking about trans women and sex work, which will be an instance of talking about a sort of a complex, systematic intermeshing of multiple modalities of oppression and how they sort of constitute a sort of system. In the abstract, I had sort of been advertised that I would also be introducing a theoretical framework for thinking about this stuff. And we may get to it. I am strongly of the view that we won't. And we'll talk about it next time. We'll have time next time. So I'm not that worried about it. This will be more than enough. I also want to say that the stuff that we're getting into now, I always draw on my experience as a trans person working, you know, among other trans folk in LA trans communities. But some of the things that I want to talk about draw on experiences I had working with LA City. Part of this group was called the Transgender Working Group, and we worked with LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, to get them to develop policies for treating trans people better than they do. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about that now, so you know that where I'm coming from. So this group started in 2007, and I didn't really get involved until 2009, 2010. Apparently, however, I just want to share this story with you. The officer that they sent to meet the working group, this was sort of the first meeting that was ever had, the vice officer, was apparently extremely offensive, and it kind of shows you. He was the person that they felt was best to represent the police department in dealing with trans folks. He basically said to the trans women there that you're all really men and you're all prostitutes. And I suppose that was his way of being nice, but it was off to an auspicious start, and needless to say. So around 2009, we hosted a forum. And so there were panelists, and I was one of the panelists, where we listened to speakers who came to speak about their experiences interacting with LAPD. And so, you know, a bunch of folks from the community were invited to come and share their experiences. And so we asked questions and we, you know, recorded this. And then afterwards, some of the panelists and some other people, we met for about a year developing policy recommendations for LAPD treatment of trans individuals. I'll just quickly show it to you if this can show up. How is it? No, it's not showing up really. Oh well. We worked on that, and that came out in 2010. And then for the next 2 years, we tried to convince LAPD to adopt some of this stuff. And it was on again, off again. At first, they didn't want to meet with us. A lot of my sort of like, you know, theoretical insights that we'll get to maybe next week, we sort of developed listening to the silly things that LAPD officers had to say with regard to some of the policy recommendations that we had introduced. I'll get to some of that later on. So eventually what happened in 2012, some of our policy recommendations were adopted. And later on, we can talk about which ones were and which ones weren't and why. And so what was interesting was that they turned around and basically said this is what they had done, and they sort of gave nobody, you know, any credit who had actually worked on getting them to do this, which was, you know, pretty funny, pretty discouraging. But, you know, we didn't care that much. We thought, well, as long as they do the work, right? As long as it happens. And that was all there was to it until I believe it was around 2016. I was invited sort of to be on this group that was also part of the LA City, called the Transgender Advisory Group that was formed by the mayor. And so I said, okay, I'll get involved in that. And one of the first things that we did was we wanted to see how things were going with LAPD and how they had fared in terms of adopting these things. And they came to this meeting, two of the officers, again, they're sort of like, we're supposed to be their best and brightest. And I was flabbergasted it was as if nobody ever told them what the policies were. They had no clue at all. And I was extremely upset. And we can get into some of the other things that were going on. They were still doing police sweeps to try to disrupt areas in which trans women were engaged in sex work. And we'll talk about why that was problematic later on. But I mean, there was no real progress, and I felt very disheartened. And I felt, well, you know, that's what you get for trying to work with the system, trying to work with a police department. And I felt demoralized. But I also thought, you know, the way things are set up, I mean, this wasn't the case for all trans individuals and their interactions with the police. However, a lot were trans women who were engaged in sex work. And when sex work is criminalized, you have a setup of sort of like cops versus the criminals, and no good can come from it. You know, things are going to go badly. And it was at that time that I realized that short of minimally, and there's so much more would need to change, but minimally the decriminalization of sex work, nothing was really going to change. So anyway, to share that with you now, to sort of get you into where I'm coming from, and some of these things are going to come up as we go through this. And you know, if you have other further questions about this experience, we can certainly talk about it more during the Q&A time. Okay, so remember, misgendering is sort of this you know, applying an identity category to someone that they don't identify with, a gendered identity category. So if someone sees themselves as non-binary, calling them a man or calling them a woman is a case of misgendering. Or if someone identifies as transsexual and you call them transgender, that's also misgendering in my view. Or if someone identifies as travesti and you know their identity is called really transgender, again, I see that as a form of misgendering, or certainly identity invalidation. Reality enforcement I see as a specific sort of misgendering. So it doesn't apply to all misgendering. And it goes beyond the categories and the meanings. And it has to do with social practices. It has to do with gender presentation and views about what is between somebody's legs. So I talk about the appearance reality contrast, right? The idea that one appears to be one way when in fact they have something else between their legs. I see this as being deeply implicated in a double bind between, on the one hand, being viewed as a deceiver, and on the other hand, being viewed as merely pretending. I also very often see this reality enforcement deeply connected to what I call genital verification. So in the case of extreme violence against trans and non-binary folk, what you will find are these cases in which a trans person is grabbed inappropriately between their legs, they're stripped, you know, their pants, chonies are pulled down to expose them, that kind of thing is a form of genital verification, and obviously it's abusive. And there are other, I would say, invasive and abusive forms, but you know, far less graphic and extreme. And this involves the sort of euphemistic communication that I was mentioning last time. So someone says, "Oh, you know, this trans individual was discovered to be anatomically female," right? This is in fact a euphemism about what is between that person's legs. Or when a trans person gets the question, "Have you had this surgery or not?" And the presumption that this is a question about genital surgery as opposed to any other form of surgery, again, is a question about what is between a person's legs. And I hope that we can agree that that type of question is invasive and rude. And then also there is such a thing as relational foreclosure that I want to want to explain in a moment. I want to bring out some of the things that I just said by talking about this argument that I've developed in reflecting on the phenomenon of reality enforcement. So, as I said, it's not just about gender categories. It's about a perceived misalignment between public gender presentation and genital status. And so what seems to be going on here is this idea that a trans person is a deceiver because they have somehow effectively falsely said through their gender presentation, with their gender presentation, as if somehow or a form of discourse, declared information about what is between their legs. And so my basic thought about that is, well, if that's true, if we think that's what's going on, then it would follow that non-trans people tell the truth about what is between their legs through the public gender presentation, which means people are walking around all the time with their gender presentation declaring, hi, I have a vagina, hi, I have a penis, and so on and so forth, which is a little bit awkward if you think about it. In fact, it's abusive because if we agree that asking for information about someone's genitals, I mean, you wouldn't even ask a friend about their genital status over dinner, is rude and invasive, then think then about a system in which our gender presentation, our public gender presentation, communicates genital status all the time, right? We would call that an abusive system because you can't opt out of it. Or if you try to opt out of it, what happens is you'll be subject to violence. You'll be subject to reality enforcement. Okay. I want to get into a little bit about what I'm talking about, foreclosure of intimacy or foreclosure of relationality. This is something I've really only come to think about clearly fairly recently. So it's sort of, I mean, I've been thinking about reality enforcement for a very, very long time. And this is a little bit new. And it was triggered a bit by Lauren Cannon, a colleague and friend of mine, who wrote this really terrific book called The Politicization of Trans Identity. And in it, he makes a friendly critique of me, and I put the quote up here. Basically, the idea is, yes, it's true, sometimes we are negatively viewed as deceivers or make-believers, i.e. pretenders. But there's another kind of bad thing that happens, although it can seem positive. And that is that someone, a non-trans person, wants to sort of prove how cool they are, how progressive they are, by like trotting out their trans friend. Oh, I have a trans friend. Oh, I'm really cool, right? I'm really progressive and rad. So in this case, Cannon says, we end up being representative as this kind of exotic specialty item on the menu, where it's exciting and new and novel and rad, right? Which seems better than being represented as a pretender or a deceiver, but it's still kind of bad, right? Because you're being tokenized. And I think he's right to a point, although what I want to suggest is that very often when we're viewed as sort of, oh yeah, this is my rad trans friend, and we're trotted out as something interesting and radical to like, you know, titillate or entertain other folks, I want to say that very often we are being viewed as make-believers. We are in that situation all along being viewed as pretenders. There's different ways of being viewed as merely engaged in make-believe. One way is a kind of very hostile way. Someone goes up to you and says, oh, that's a man in a dress, ha ha ha, right? This person is trying to pretend that they're a woman, or this person is trying to pretend that they're man. That's one way to do it. Another way is the other person plays along. So they engage in role play with you because they take you to be pretending, they pretend as well. Sometimes I even think they don't even know that they're pretending. They think that they're not. They have a vested interest in being perceived as a good person. And so they take themselves to be the real deal, but they're not. It ends up that what's going on is in fact a kind of role play. And the way that you can tell that it's role play is not at the time necessarily, is later on down the road. Things come out in the wash, issues suddenly appear. This typically happens when someone decides to take the make-believe too far. So I gave this example last time, right? It's all fun and games to pretend you're a brain surgeon, right? At a Halloween party. You better not go actually operating on someone's brain. That's taking it too far. There are limits to pretense. Don't take it too far. And so what happens is someone can be treating you like a woman or a man and things seem great, but then suddenly where it seems like, oh no, now we're taking it too far. Now the pretense is going too far. Then suddenly the problems emerge. So you didn't notice the problems before. It seemed great. It seemed like you're accepted. Now suddenly it's not, because it seems like the pretense has gone too far. And I call these, I call the gender pretense that is taken too far calamities of intimacy, because it turns out that things get too far in the case of imagined gender make-believe when issues around intimacy arise, particularly sexual intimacy. It's suddenly then that, oh, wait a minute, no, oh, okay. You're not really a woman, you're not really a man. It's fine that you present this way at work. I'll call you by the right pronoun, but let's not take this pretense too far. I think that this is actually a really important phenomenon, and I've been thinking a lot about it lately. And it's what I mean by this idea of foreclosure of relationality, because then as a trans person, you have this choice. You can either come out as trans, and then the best that you're going to get among trans people is this sort of playing along, right? Where ultimately intimacy will be foreclosed, because as soon as the prospect of intimacy arises, oh, we're taking the pretense too far. Or you don't come out as trans, and then you are vulnerable to being exposed as deceiving somebody about who you are, okay? So I centralize reality enforcement when I think about trans oppression. And it's not because I think that reality enforcement is the only form of trans oppression. But I do think it's extremely, extremely important. I think that it is the basis for most other forms of transphobia. Let me give you a couple of examples. So a trans man may be discriminated against because he's viewed as a woman who's acting really, really butch, really, really masculine. And so the person goes, hey, it's not okay for women to act masculine like that. It's a different kind of phobia, you might think, right? It's like a different type of phobia. But note that it's predicated, that it's based upon the view that this trans man is really a woman. Because if this trans man wasn't viewed as really a woman, they wouldn't be viewed as too masculine. They'd be probably viewed as just right? So there's this more basic thing that's going on, and it is this misgendering reality enforcement that is at play. I also think that by focusing on reality enforcement, we get a deeper understanding of misgendering. I think that it is too easy for people to say, look, just get the pronouns right, just get the names right. Often what happens, I think, is that, you know, in public spaces, at work, people go along with it. But that kind of response or that kind of correction to misgendering, I would say isn't enough. Because if what I've said is right, if reality enforcement is prevalent, then very often, even if someone is gendering a trans person correctly, could really be a form of just simply playing along because that person is viewed as pretending. And to really sort of get to the bottom of misgendering, really sort of changing this is going to require more than getting the pronouns right, getting the labels right in this or that context, right? It is going to require rethinking how we do relations. It is going to require getting rid of those calamities of intimacy so that you accept a trans person as who they are, right? Say in the work environment, but also when intimacy looms, right? As soon as intimacy looms, the pretense can end because it would in this situation not actually be a mere pretense. Hopefully that makes sense. I also think it is important because for many of us, for many trans folk, this phenomenon of reality enforcement shapes your everyday interactions with the world. You know, I mean, I've been transitioned for 1 million years now, but still, you know, if I'm going out to buy groceries and I get a funny look from the cashier, I'm on alert, right? As a trans woman who is also a mother, right, I'm always apprehensive meeting mothers of my daughter's friends because I'm a trans woman. I'm wondering, oh, are they gonna read me as trans? And if they read me as trans, what does that mean? So it gets, and this is just me, I mean, but I think that it affects a great many trans people in our negotiations of intimacy. And finally, I think that reality enforcement, I mean, obviously structures questions around passing or not passing. I mean, it frames the question. I mean, if a trans person can pass as non-trans, they automatically are going to face this dilemma between, on the one hand, being a deceiver, and on the other, being a pretender. Okay, so that was the long review. Although it's actually, hopefully this time has much more meat on it. I'd like to now start talking about the concept of intersectionality. So when we talk about oppression, so we think about trans oppression, sexist oppression, racist oppressions, it is not uncommon to think of them as sort of like vectors or axes. Right? And so the concept of intersectionality, even though the ideas had been around and articulated certainly well before Crenshaw articulated and popularized the concept of intersectionality in two very influential articles, Demarginalizing the Intersections and Mapping the Margins, in which she talked about, right, you cannot focus on just one oppression at a time. There are in fact multiple oppressions, and they intersect. And intersect really does suggest this idea of, if you will, streets, you know, that intersect with each other. And then sort of the thought is, if you're standing in the intersection, you can get hit with both. You can get hit with racist oppression and sexist oppression. So if you're a Black woman, right, you can deal with racist oppression and sexist oppression because you're standing in the intersection. And so our business as well is, when we're thinking about trans oppression, it's not enough to think about trans oppression. We must think about ways in which it intersects with sexist oppression, ways in which it intersects with racist oppression, ableist oppression, classist oppression. It becomes very, very complicated. And that's what the path that we're going down a little bit now. So the fact is, the concept of intersectionality is extremely difficult. I mean, at least it is for me, very difficult. And I confess to you, I've been teaching this concept to my students for a good 20 years. And every time I teach it, I feel like I peel away a layer of the onion and learn something new. So what I just said about intersecting streets is really only the surface phenomenon of what's really going on here. And consequently, there has been much discussion in the philosophical literature about the concept of intersectionality. Some have become critical of it for various different reasons. I'm still a believer in it. However, I think that certainly this representation of it as sort of the mere intersection or overlapping of multiple vectors is insufficient. And certainly if you read the Crenshaw articles, it's clear that she thinks so too. She gives many metaphors besides this one of intersections among streets. And it's clear that the thought going on there is more complex. And I want to talk a little bit about one way in which it's more complex today. It's actually even more complicated than this. But I want to talk about the difference between double damage and intermeshing oppressions, right? The way that I described it, if you think about it in terms of intersections, right? If you're standing at the intersection, you're at risk of getting hit from two streets at once. The car is on Racism Street and the car is on Sexism Street, right? So we can think of damage as like two harms added together, or two occurrences of harms. And let me just give you a mundane example. So suppose someone is walking down the street and someone calls them a sexist name, right? And then someone else calls them a racist name, right? Because that person, right, is a woman and a woman of color. Now, two harms happen. First, the sexist dispersion, and then the racist dispersion. Those are two distinct harms. We call that double damage. One of the phenomena that Crenshaw was trying to get at was this idea of intermeshing. And here I'm using terminology from the philosopher Maria Lugones. And the idea here is, it's not like you have two distinct harms. Oh, here's some racism and here's some sexism. Really, you only have one thing, one harm, but it functions as both. So it's an instance of both, say, racist oppression and sexist oppression. So here are a couple of examples that I wanted to share with you. One is a quote from Angela Davis from her famous article, Rape and the Myth of the Black Rapist. She uses the terminology slave, and this is just older terminology, which is why I've put this here. Generally, these days, we don't say slave, we say enslaved people, to make very clear what's going on here. But the point that she's making is that enslaved Black females were vulnerable to sexual violence, right, by these men who profess to own them. Now, this sexual violence is clearly something that is anti-feminist, right? It's misogynist, it's sexual and sexist. But it's also racist because it comes from this notion of racial supremacy. It comes from this idea, it comes from the phenomenon of enslavement, right? There is one harm, the rape in this case, but it is a way of the master to not only sexually and sexistly subordinate an enslaved Black woman, but also to racistly subordinate. So it is instantiating two distinct oppressions at the same time. Another example I'm drawing from C. Riley Snorton and his remarkable book, Black on Both Sides. And he talks about James Marion Sims, who was a gynecologist who developed the surgical techniques. And the way that he developed these techniques was by operating on enslaved Black females. And he did so also without proper anesthesia. And of course, they had no choice in it. And this was sort of the basis for development in various different medical technologies. But now the point is, right, this violation of these women was clearly one that was grounded in misogyny or sexism, right? It was about, right, performing these non-consensual surgeries on these female bodies, but it was also predicated on racial domination, and it was both at the same time. It was one harm that instantiated both racism and sexism at once. And so that's the sort of thing that I'm really wanting to think about today. And it's one of the reasons why this intersection metaphor, despite the fact that Crenshaw cites it, doesn't capture the model of the intersection doesn't capture this notion of intermeshing oppressions, and Crenshaw's well aware of that. And I want to start moving now to thinking about intermeshing oppressions within a trans context, specifically in terms of reality enforcement. And one of the sort of most glaring ones, and this is something that you'll see whenever you look at sort of extreme reality enforcement committed against the trans man, is that there is very typically a rape. There is a sexual violence against that trans guy, okay? And what this rape does is it does two things at once. One, it's designed to enforce reality, to say, no, you are really a woman, and by raping you as a woman. And obviously it is a form of sexist, misogynist violence. So it is the instantiation of both reality enforcement, a form of trans oppression, and also sexist oppression at once. With this in mind, I want to turn to thinking about trans women, because there's an interesting problem here that's bothering me for a while, at least theoretically. You might think, how is it that a trans woman could be subject to the intermeshing of trans oppression and sexist oppression? Because look, either a trans woman is viewed as really a man, and if she's viewed as really a man, then she won't be subject to sexist oppression, right? Or if she's passing as a woman, read non-trans woman, right, and she's subject to sexist oppression, then at that time, it doesn't seem as if she's subject to trans oppression. So how can we think about ways in which trans women are subject to the intermeshing of both sexist and trans oppression at once, specifically when we're thinking about reality enforcement? I mean, and it happens, like, as a trans woman, right? Any trans woman knows that this happens all the time, this intermeshing of trans oppression and sexist oppression. Yet there's this weird sort of theoretical issue around sort of explaining how that is. So as we're thinking about this, I want to go back to what I'm calling the calamities of intimacy, of which there are two. So remember I said that when this idea that some folks play along with trans people, they're like, all right, I'll call you a woman, I'll call you a man, whatever. And the make-believe ends when things go too far. And things go too far, right, when sexual intimacy rears its head. And so one of the calamities is having sex with the wrong person, right? So worries about who you have sex with and what their perceived gender is. So you may remember last time we distinguished sexual orientation from sexual identity. We think of sexual orientation as sort of your sexuality, what you in fact eroticize, what is erotic to you. And sexual identity is the way that you categorize yourself, right? So you can categorize yourself as a straight person, as a straight man, as a gay man, as a lesbian, and so forth. Those are various different sexual identities. And what ends up happening, right, is if a straight identified man has sex with a trans woman and he views her as really a man, right, then this may be threatening to his sexual identity because he sees himself as straight. Okay, so one of the ways of thinking about this is in terms of what I call a spillover effect. That is, a person who is in some perceived sexual relationship with a trans woman may, in the end, have their own sexual identity called into question as a consequence of the trans person they're with. So let me give you a personal example. So I became friends with this non-trans woman, lesbian identified, and she brought me around to all of her, non-trans lesbian friends, and they were very warm and accepting, and everybody was very happy. And then I started to date this woman. And suddenly she found her identity, her sexual identity called into question. They said, "Oh, are you no longer lesbian? Are you bi?" Or, right? Why would they start viewing her as bi? Or why would they start viewing her as no longer a lesbian? Unless it were the case, right, that I was not viewed as really a woman. So the interesting thing here is your own sexual identity in sort of like sexual relation with a trans person can be called into question. And so one of the ways of thinking about it is that there can be a tension between, on the one hand, sexual desire and sexual identity. Let me explain this. So you take a trans woman, right? Now imagine that this trans woman passes completely as, right, a non-trans woman, and the experience and what she does in a sexual interaction with this other non-trans person is going to be virtually indistinguishable from what would happen were there a non-trans woman there instead, right? There's no erotic difference. There's no erotic difference. And so if you're attracted to this person, right, it's because you're attracted to women, right? You just happen to be attracted to this person who is trans. Erotically, there's no distinction typically. However, if this trans woman is viewed as really a man, right, now suddenly what is effectively the same eroticism is going to count against the sexual identity, and that person is going to be invalidated. Okay. So this is when you get the sort of like stop, time out, no more pretending, right? And I used to think about this going from sort of like non-intimate context into intimate context. This idea that like, well, a man will be perfectly happy to treat a trans woman as a woman in a certain, say, non-intimate work environment, but should questions of sexual intimacy come up, then suddenly, no. Now you're really a man. Now the pretense must stop. I used to think about it going in the direction of the non-intimate to the intimate, but I realized fairly recently that I should think about it sort of more importantly going the other direction, going from the intimate to the non-intimate. The reason for that is in part because the tension is between, on the one hand, possible sexual attraction and the block that comes in at the sexual identity, or at least what someone else is going to say about your sexual identity. This may be a little bit obscure, so hopefully this can be fleshed out when I start to throw some details at it. Many trans women know this truth, and I'm going to state it bluntly, probably a bit too generally for it to be true, but most straight men will have sex with trans women behind closed doors, so long as their friends don't find out about it, or so long as their friends don't already know and are involved in it, right? What they're worried about is not necessarily having sex with that trans woman, right? It is other people finding out about it, and then that person being represented as gay, and then that affecting how they're viewed, how they're ranked by other males in this sort of straight totem pole, if you will. So what ends up happening then is there is this block where trans women can be very easily constituted as dirty little secrets, in which what ends up happening is the non-trans man that you're with treats you as sort of a replacement woman, like good enough, filling in because no one else is around. You'll do just nicely. so long as it's a dirty little secret, and friends don't find out. Okay. And what I want to point out is this block from moving from intimate to non-intimate, to this idea, well, I'm not going to show you to my friends. You're not the girl I'm going to take home and introduce to my mother, right? You're not that type. Constitutes trans women as the other woman, or the whore, or the woman who ends up getting fucked behind the scenes by these guys, but is not the person who ends up in a relationship with him. And what I want to point out is that this thing is precisely the type of structure that it's not just restricted to trans women. This is kind of how it goes, right? If you are in various ways a stigmatized woman, you can find yourself relegated to the status of dirty little secret. So for example, if you are a large woman, if you're considered not beautiful by certain prevalent cultural standards, you may find yourself a dirty little secret, right? Or if you are not able-bodied, you may find yourself a dirty little secret. And so it's not just trans women who find themselves dirty little secrets, but once you find yourself a dirty little secret, that has a habit of sort of perpetuating itself, so that, right, you're not ever going to not be a dirty little secret, because being the sort of woman who, just has sex with a guy in that type of way ends up not really being fit for a long-term marriage kind of scenario, I suppose. But here's the point, sort of, actually, I want to add another little thing. One of the things that I find really interesting here is you end up with something called the economy of intimacy. And what I mean is this, is that if you are constituted as a dirty little secret, if you're a person, a woman who ends up being stigmatized for any reason of this sort, right, you're cut off from a sort of standard connection to intimacy you might want. And because you're cut off from it, and because you want it, you want intimacy, you may end up choosing to take what you can get. And so what ends up happening is, because you choose to take what you can get, you end up being relegated to the status of a dirty little secret. Notice this is a structural situation. It's a structural situation that is set up through allocations of intimacy, who gets what, and it's set up by stigma. Yet obviously what ends up happening is the woman who is the dirty little secret ends up being held accountable as it were having a defective moral character. And so you get this idea of like, oh yeah, trans women, they're just like, they just want to get fucked, they're sexually promiscuous, right? As if it were a character feature of trans women, when in fact it is a structural feature of the operations between, on the one hand, right, the eroticization, the willingness of non-trans men to have sex with trans women, and then the calamity of intimacy that forecloses them from entering into a public relationship. And here you have an intermeshing of oppressions, because on the one hand, you have this relegation to dirty little secret that is common to, right, other women, right, besides trans women, but the specific reason that trans women are relegated to this status has to do with our Constitution as merely pretending. Let me also mention that one of the things that you see is the cover-up. So very often, in my opinion, when trans women are accused of deceiving some men into having sex, what has actually happened is that those men knew she was trans, had sex with her, but then were found out by their friends, and to preserve their sexual identity, lashed out and claimed that that she had engaged in this deception that she had not. So it's about saving face. The second calamity that I want to talk about is sex segregation. And so you may very well be familiar with these types of discussions. But the idea, right? So like, bathroom wars, like should trans women be allowed in to the women's restroom, that type of thing. It has been the subject of conservative and transphobic feminist sort of worries for a while now. But I will say that these worries about sex segregation and maintaining sex segregation do go beyond mere restrooms, public restrooms. They also concern changing rooms, public changing rooms, but they also importantly include sex segregated shelters like homelessness shelters, domestic violence shelters. They also concern prison housing, so where you're housed in prison. And they also include who searches your body, right? Does a male-bodied individual search you, or does a female? All of those things are profoundly connected to these themes around sex segregation. And I say this as a calamity again, because what ends up happening is you have someone who's like, oh, yes, I accept you as a woman, but then suddenly the calamity arises. Oh, but you can't, you're not allowed into this, you're not allowed into this changing room. Or, oh no, we have to, house you with the men. You do not have access to this domestic violence shelter because it's only for women and you're not allowed there, right? So then suddenly the calamities arise, and what had seemed like acceptance is now constituted as mere role play. So this is one of the things that I learned. One of the things that we argued for in sort of working with PD was that trans women should be housed in the female side of sort of like the jail unit. We also argued that it should be separate, like it should be a segregated unit. We also argued that the trans person who is about to be invasively searched, say strip searched, should be able to choose the sex of the person who searches them. This is particularly important because, as you may know, depending upon the various different interventions that a trans person has chosen, their bodies may be all over the place and sort of like highly complex. Let's put it that way. And these things were opposed at first by LAPD, but the examples, the worries they had were not only, I mean, they were absurd. They were absurd. I mean, the worries that are cited, I think, often when it's concerns about trans women in a particular sort of sex segregated space are absurd on their face. So, for example, they were worried about trans women peeking at non-trans women if they were in a vulnerable situation. So they were worried about visual access. They were worried about decency offenses. They were literally worried about trans women waving their genitalia at non-trans women to upset them. They were worried about a female officer searching a trans woman who had not had bottom surgery. They were worried that she might turn around and rape the searching officers. Somehow they thought that violence couldn't happen if she had had bottom surgery. I mean, just these really, really insane notions. And it got me thinking, like, what's going on here? These fears about sex segregation, they always cite this potential for violence, right, against women, violence, right, sexual assault, right, and they do so by constituting trans women as really men. And there's a way in which this constitution also sort of brings into highlight what you might think of as the the underlying justification for sex segregation at all, right? We keep the females and the males separate so the males won't violate the females. That's why we do it, right? And so when they're saying, no, 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 trans women can't go here, they're saying, no, the rationale for sex segregation is to keep the males from raping the females, and we're constituting these trans women as males. And by the way, putting them in a place, for example, if you think about it, putting a trans woman into prison with men does, of course, put her at risk for sexual violence. So happily, you saved the non-trans woman from this alleged violence, but put the trans woman under the gun for that violence. But these rationales make no sense. And so it occurred to me that really what was going on is this way of productively coding bodies, right? They want to code the trans woman's body as male, and they want to code male as rapey, and they want to code female as rapeable, right? So they're doing this kind of odd work when they're citing these sex segregation rationales. And I've been thinking about like ways in which, I mean, it's just plain that these sex segregation rationales aren't really operative. And here's why. I'm going to cut to the chase rather than going into some of the nuances of this. Invariably, what happens in these discussions is that trans men are erased, utterly erased in these concerns. So I got into this debate with this one philosopher who is an anti-trans, sort of transphobic feminist. And she was arguing that, you know, trans women are not really women and they shouldn't be in the restroom with non-trans women. And I said to her, I said, well, what do you think about trans guys? Like, do you think that they should be like in the restroom with non-trans women? And she said, well, they probably wouldn't like it very much, but I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't be concerned. So here what happens is that the trans man is constituted as not a risk. It's not a risk for sexual violence or sexual harassment or whatever. And it's clear to me that she was just not thinking this through. Because think it through. If you were to have trans men, now imagine fully androgenated on T trans men, right? Faces like masculinized faces, beards, etc. Walking in to the women's restroom, this philosopher wouldn't mind. Really, she wouldn't mind. And what if the trans guys who were so pissed off are being treated this way started leering in protest and making sexist comments about the women there? No problem. The absurdity here is outstanding. And what I think that it shows is that these rationales are fake. There's not really a concern about women really being harassed in the female restroom. There's an effort to code bodies in certain ways as rapeable or rapey, right? And to justify sex segregation in terms of it. I also think that this is why, sorry, I'm gonna pause. I'm getting a little bit flabbergasted because I see that we're already at 5 after 5. And I want to make sure that we have time for questions. And I have so much more to go because after this, I wanted to talk about trans women in sex work. Well, there's just that bit.
You can go until 7:10 or 7:15 if you want. Like
okay.
10 more minutes.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll rush it through, and then maybe I'll get a chance to sort of elaborate next time or through question and answer. But I do want to sort of finish by talking about sex work. and ways in which sort of the intermeshing of multiple oppressions really structure sex work, trans women and sex work as a system. Okay, so first I want to think about the forces that create trans women and sex work. And so we can think about this along an economic model of supply and demand. Right? So the first question then becomes, how do you create a pool of women, right, who are available to engage in this sort of sex work, right? And I want to step back and be clear. What I'm about to say is not meant to critique sex work per se. As I mentioned earlier, my belief is that it should be decriminalized. However, I also think that close attention needs to be paid to the systems as they currently exist and how they get set up, and the conditions that lead individuals to engage in sex work. So for example, if the reason you're engaging in sex work is because you can't get a job anywhere else because of transphobia, well, that's a problem, right? And so this is sort of what I'm looking at here. And I want to suggest that there's a lot of things that conspire. So if you think about the role of transphobia in the lack of familial support or the lack of access to educational resources, right? And the lack of employment opportunities, as I mentioned, right? You can see how this is conducing to creating a supply. And there are other ways as well. So one of the important things I'll mention here is the right to exit. So one of the things that you would expect to be important is the right to exit sex work should you choose to, right? And to exit sex work, though, does require, in the current situation, programs, shelters, ways of helping sex workers get on their feet. And the reality is that not a lot of programs and shelters exist for trans women. And the reason for it is reality enforcement, right? We just covered this, right? The worry is that like, oh, we cannot let a trans woman into this domestic violence shelter. Oh, we cannot let a trans woman into this homeless shelter. Oh, these programs for exiting sex workers are for females only, they're not for trans women. And so trans women don't have the resources. So if they're dumped out of jail or out of prison, right, what recourse are they gonna have? What resources are they gonna have? Well, back they go, right? So no right to exit. Consider then ways in which transphobia, reality enforcement is structured into all of these factors. But now, right, we can easily start thinking about other things being factored into this. Certainly in the United States, economics and the distribution of economic resources is heavily racialized, right? So if you're dealing with lack of economic resources, educational resources, discrimination in the workplace, and you're dealing with this also now owing to race, then this is going to seem even more precarious, right? Okay. What creates the demand? Again, one of the interesting features is that if you are doing trans sex work as a trans woman, this isn't always the case, there's a niche market. There's a niche market for the particular sexuality that one might have with a trans woman specifically. And this means a couple of things. One, it means, and I really do feel like I'm rushing this through. I really do feel like I ought to come back to this, but I'm going to rush it through, and I'll do a do-over next time as well, a little bit to spell this out. Ways in which trans women can be eroticized can also be reality enforcement can be eroticized. So for example, if what you eroticize is feminizing a man, that's your eroticism, and you go to a trans woman to do it, right? the eroticization that you apply to the trans woman is one that regards her as a man who is being feminized, right? Which again is going to be a case of reality enforcement. Meanwhile, there are forces that don't create or produce sex work, or don't seem to anyway, that on the face of it seem to push it out of reality, specifically street sex work. So obviously there's, because I know in Peru that sex work is officially legal, but only certain forms of it is legal, and I believe that street sex work is not. It continues to be criminalized. In any event, one of the things that you get if you're doing street sex work is, of course, harassment. One of the things that used to happen to the trans women who work Santa Monica Boulevard is that some of the gangs would ride by and they would shoot water guns at them that had either urine in it or bleach, right? Just to harass them. But of course, there are other forms of violence that you can be subject to if you're a trans woman, sort of forced into dangerous visibility on the street. Of course, you're also then vulnerable to police harassment. And then if you are sent to jail or to prison, you're going to be subject to these versions of reality enforcement through various forms of sex segregation that I just talked about, right? So you may be housed, you may be placed in an all-male prison facility. You may be searched by male officers and harassed and raped by male officers. So there's two things going on here. One are the forces, the supply and demand that create trans sex work, and then there are the forces that push against it. And both of these things are really structured by transphobia, and in particular reality enforcement. But one of the things that it does seem to me, and I sort of want to suggest, is that the forces that push against trans sex work, I think they're part of the system. I think that they actually serve simply to destabilize, and which leads to reductions in the cost. So for example, typically what happens is the police, they'll abide the street sex work, but then every now and then they'll bust it up. They'll do a street sweep. So they'll come in and they'll bust it up. They'll come down Santa Monica Boulevard and move the sex workers elsewhere. What this does is it simply destabilizes. It removes the ability to sort of like take responsibility for your business, to be a genuine entrepreneur. If you're constantly trying to like find turf on which to work, right, it's very hard to be stable in that respect. So here you have a system, an integrated system that sort of comes at you from all sides, right? It's an economic system. So what I've hopefully done here is shown sort of the class dimension, right? Shown here how economics, materiality matter to the constitution of trans sex work. But also I want to go back to the US. I mean, certainly in the US, racialization and criminalization go hand in hand. I mean, the US has the largest prison population in the world, and the racial proportions are through the roof, right? And it's just clear that criminalization and the criminal justice system is used to target Black folk in this country. And so what you get here is a system in which, right, the most vulnerable trans women are placed in these situations in which they continue to be vulnerable. And it's a system that brings together, that interblends racial dynamics, economic dynamics, transphobic dynamics, and sexist dynamics. And with that, I will stop, because I know you probably have tons of questions, and I apologize for rushing that through. But thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So if anyone has questions, you can use the chat. And we can start with a Q&A. Okay, so maybe while we wait for people to start writing questions, I was just going to ask, in the beginning when you started talking about sex work, if there's a previous discussion to use the term sex work instead of prostitution, or if not. The reason I ask is because when I've interviewed sex workers that are trans women, a few of them would say that they did not want to refer to them as sex workers because that would imply that it's a type of work, but they do not have like any conditions to do it. And it was like so hard for them that they would prefer to call it prostitution, you know, because in their minds it was like people feel better if they say sex work, when for us it's not, it doesn't have any sort of conditions that any type of work would have. So
I agree with you. I mean, I agree with you, and I appreciate that point. And I think that this brings us back to the questions around terminology. And I think that, you know, had I had the time, I would have problematized this a bit more. I mean, one of the issues is that, you know, sex work is technically speaking too broad, right? It covers many things besides prostitution, right? And I want to talk specifically about what some people call prostitution, but then some people think that prostitution is stigmatizing. But as you point out, and this coheres with what I've just said, given the situation, the structural situation, it's really difficult to think of this as work, right? And so, I mean, I think I would be fine with that. And you know, I've sometimes toyed with the idea of talking about commercial sex, or the provision of commercial sex. I don't know if that would do, right? But anyway, I think that what you're making is a great point.
Yeah, also because in Peru, I'm not sure how it is in the US, but in Peru, trans women that are sex workers are usually what you call street sex work.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so like the conditions that they face are worse than the conditions that maybe cis women that are sex workers face. So I think it also has to do with that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so now we have a question. So, okay, so we have a few in Spanish. I'm gonna read the one in English first, and then I'll translate the other ones. So this is from Anne Gary. She says, I wasn't going to ask a question since I am Talia's colleague, but let me do it anyway. It's about the intersection of gender with trans people and women. You and I discussed awareness of this long ago. It looks like you've resolved the awareness by attending to the specificity of trans oppression along with sexism. Is this the way you see the resolution?
I don't know. I think I'm still working on the resolution. I think that I'm like groping towards it. Because for me, the difficulty was, even with sort of thinking about reality enforcement specifically, thinking about how trans women could be subject to reality enforcement and subject to sexist oppression at the same time baffled me. Because on the face of it, it looks like it shouldn't be possible, and yet it is. And so I am trying to address that today by sort of showing that the very conditions that subject trans women to being constituted as pretenders, that is, these various different calamities of intimacy, are also doing work structurally, subjecting them to something that is at least structurally akin to what other women experience.
Okay, so if Anne has any comment, you can also write it in the chat, and I will. So she says, I understand. Okay. So we have a couple of questions about sex work. So we have one from Manuel Abelardo Cárdenas. And so he says, could it be affirmed that sex work, being accepted by a patriarchal society, it is assigned legal space for people of gender diversity?
Well, I think yes. So certainly the relegation of trans women specifically to sex work or to prostitution, I think does cohere with this idea of a patriarchy or male domination. When you think about sort of the idea of creating the availability of people to cater to your every sexual taste, right? So if you set up a system whereby which trans women are funneled into a sex work system and prevented from leaving, then clearly to me that is consistent with patriarchy. I think that patriarchy is more complicated. I think that one of the things I've hoped to show is that, like, insofar as sort of the straight white patriarchal guy will fuck a trans woman behind closed doors, there's room for it. Now, I don't know if I'm completely answering your question, but I hope so. I do believe that there is the possibility of a sort of sex work that is not patriarchal. That may well be possible. I don't know, but I'm not going to rule it out. And perhaps in such a situation, there would be room for gender diversity. But I don't see it now. The only gender diversity that you would see would be the various different niche markets, the various different sexual tastes of the men who avail themselves of the services. If I didn't answer the question.
I think the concerns, because the other question is similar in a way. The other question is from, Emma Ceballos. So she says, from what you have said about sex work, can it be understood that it should be protected as if it could be a job opportunity? I think it has to do with what you said about sex work in the end, like if it should be protected, if it should be legal. I think that's something that maybe has people thinking.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult situation. I have a colleague of mine who wrote half a book arguing that sex work, prostitution isn't sex work because it bears important disanalogies from work. In terms of like employment contract and things like that, right? So what she argues for is a Norwegian model in which the Johns are criminalized and the women are not. And so she's for an abolitionist position on this, like just get rid of it, and this is how. And I did say to her, that's great. However, if you do that, as it stands right now, right, there's going to be a lot of trans women with no resources, no decent economic opportunities at all, on the condition that sex work cease to exist. You would need to change a lot more than that. You would need it to be the case that trans folks are getting access to educational and economic opportunities, are getting access to job opportunities besides sex work. Because if you don't have that, then what else are trans women going to do? But to be clear, I'm not saying yes. And I have to be honest, I myself have never, I almost did, but I've never engaged in sex work myself. But I have many friends who have and who do. And there's mixed views about it. You know, I have some friends who view this as, yes, it's a, you know, it's kind of like, I see this as a little business. I'm making some money. No other job, you know, is going to pay me what I need to get myself the gender technologies I need to feel good about myself, right? You know, working at McDonald's isn't going to help, right? So that's one view. Another view is, you know, this is horrible. I got drawn into this because I started to do crystal meth, and then I needed to trick to get the money to afford the crystal meth, and this has a lot to do with feeling bad about myself. I now find myself in these situations where I have to let these men do these things to me that I feel degrading and that are in fact transphobic and invalidating to my identity as a woman every day, and they grind me down. I don't want to be part of it. And so I hear those things. I hear in between. I hear a lot of complexity. And so I don't think that there's one easy answer like yay or nay. And that's why I was trying to break down these different structural features, right? One of the things that you need is I mean, there is trans sex work, right? If you're going to eliminate, if you could one day eliminate trans sex work, then you better bloody well be able to have employment opportunities for trans women that are decent employment opportunities, not working at, you know, something that is very low paid, that is not going to provide her with the gender technologies that she needs, right? Okay, so, but one of the things that you're going to need is the right to exit, right? I mean, clearly what exists now is not okay. I mean, and I agree with the view like, well, maybe it's not really work, right? I mean, you know, maybe it's something else altogether. But to change it, right, you need to look at the different factors and see what needs changing, right? Definitely the right to exit. Definitely there need to be programs that don't discriminate against trans women, right? There needs to be a way for trans women to go to homeless shelters, right? In ways that don't have their identities invalidated, right? So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think it's very complicated, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yes, so Manuel has a follow-up. Maybe I think that because a lot of people are very interested in what you're saying about sex work, would you like to go back to the slides, maybe like the part that you were not able to finish?
Okay, I mean, I just sort of feel like I went through it really fast, and that's the thing. So okay. I'm going to go back to it then.
Okay, so she says that if trans oppression comes from reality enforcement and can manifest itself from a part of false acceptance of us, what kind of interventions do we need to make when cultural change is slow and appeals only to the tolerance of our existence and not to the acceptance of our identity? I express this because even though I am treated with my identity in state institutions, I know it is not honest, and it is more because if I am not treated with respect, I could appeal to discrimination. I don't know if it's more fear than really seeing us, I think.
That's a terrific question, and I really, really appreciate it. And obviously, like, you're really bringing out and hitting on the point, one of the important points I was trying to make today, you know, that this sort of acceptance is not real acceptance, and that it won't be real acceptance, right, until full relationality is possible, until these calamities of intimacy are eliminated, right? And I have to be honest and pessimistic. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I don't think that society is very apt to change in that way. But I'll offer some reflections about how it would need to change. So for me, I get my consolation in trans subcultures where, I find gender done very differently. I'm going to go back to the point that I was insisting on earlier, namely that in dominant society, public gender presentation is taken to communicate genital status. This is seen as terribly important. In the trans subcultures that I'm familiar with, you don't, just because someone has a particular gender presentation, you don't know what's between their legs, right? And that may not be the most important thing to you, even from a sexual point of view, but rather this is something you would get to know over the course of intimacy. It's a much better system, I think. I don't think that things will change until we start to do intimacy differently. So, for example, I think that if we were in a situation in which people couldn't make assumptions about what was between your legs based on public gender presentation, that would be a good start. I think that more fluidity with regard to right now, the way we characterize sexual identity is in terms of the gender of the person you're attracted to. The sexualities are way more complicated than that, right? It's a very, very thin model. And I think that much more of an openness to the variations in sexuality without condemnation would also need to change. I mean, there's so much that would need to change. But I think that I think that this actually might be a first step. First step is to say to people, you know what, this whole idea of like, we're going to get it institutionally right, and we'll get the pronouns right, we'll get the names right? That's not enough. That's not enough. It's not even close to enough, because as far as I'm concerned, it could very well just be you playing along, right? I think that might be the beginning of a conversation in the right direction.
Thank you. So we have Naomi's Shimon's question. So it's it's a little bit long, so bear with me while I read it. So she says, I find your analysis of being the dirty little secret is compelling and important, but I want to bring up another sort of intimacy issues. Your arguments about attention to trans people's genitals are also wonderful, but what do you want to say about this situation? In situations of sexual intimacy might have happened, we have appropriate interest in our partner's genitals. I'm thinking about an heterosexual cis woman who is erotically drawn to penises. For example, to the experience of having a vulnerable, temporarily tumescent body part inside of one. Is there something problematic about finding the impossibility of that being a sexual turn-off? For a range of reasons, someone's being a trans man being only one. And might there be analogous reasons why an heterosexual trans man might desire specifically intravaginal intercourse? And these cases of calamities of intimacy, or might they just fall under the category of very specific sexual desires, like paraphilias? So it would be like discovering that a potential partner wasn't. And then she says, into one's particular kinks. That sound be an yeah. So then she adds that it's an heterosexual cis man. Yeah. So Naomi, if you want to add something, I can open your mic. I'm sorry, I maybe didn't.
I think that I also know Naomi, and this is we could probably continue some of this later on, but I want to say a couple of things. So you take the person who's like strongly erotically drawn to penises. Let's take that example, right? Okay. On the face of it, I think that's fine. Although I would be interested in the following question. I mean, in what does the eroticism consist? Does the eroticism consist in filleting the penis and holding the penis and looking at the penis. These are very different activities. And then I would want to know, could a phallus do just as nicely? And if a phallus couldn't do just as nicely, why not? So there's one thing. And then let's suppose that no, the only thing that really works for her is a flesh and blood penis. Then I think that people have their erotic interests, and people are allowed to have their erotic interests. If that was sort of the most important feature of her sexuality, then so be it. But notice here, though, that when we get to know people, right, presumably at this point, we don't marry someone before finding out if we're sexually compatible, right? We don't form, and so you'd never get stuck in that situation. You'd be doing some sexual exploration, and you'd find out, right, that, there was a kind of thing that you liked erotically that this person didn't have. I mean, I think that in that case, you might just move on or something like that, as anyone would if they were sort of looking for something in a partner sexually and that they didn't find it in the end. So I don't know. Hopefully that. I'm sorry. I get so tired at this time of night and I begin to mutter, and it frustrates me so much.
Okay, so I'm gonna so I'm going to open Naomi's microphone because I think she wants to do a follow-up. Okay, here it is. Hi, Naomi.
Hi, thanks, Aracha, and thanks, Talia. I realized as I was writing up my question, I was beginning to answer it, and I think you were answering it better. That is, I think thinking of it as along the line of some kind of kink. That is, this is what I think I really want. And then I discovered that my potential partner, although attractive in all kinds of other ways, isn't into this particular thing that I like to do. And then, as you were saying, I might say, oh, here's what they're into. And I've never thought of that, but this is kind of fun and exciting, and it can get expanded. And so I think that if we sort of move away from this is the normal, this is what people ought to want, to, well, yeah, people want what they want. And sometimes it's kind of weird and sometimes it's very specific, but we can open up and be flexible and be playful and creative and so on. So I think that does kind of get at it. I was feeling sort of hung up on this, but I think you're getting me unhung up. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Oh, okay, so this question was from Manuel. It was a follow-up question when you were talking about sex work. And from what I can see, I think she wants you to expand more in the interlinks between the ecological, I'm sorry, trans philosophy and decolonial theory. Yeah, because you were talking about race in your analysis, so I think she wants you to expand a little bit more on like again. What's wrong with me?
Okay, here's the short answer to that. And I'll just sort of cut to the chase, right? I mean, one of the so I'm drawing on Quijano here, who argues for sort of not just thinking about like wage labor kind of thing, but just sort of a broader view where we talk about like slave labor and serfdom and sort of a variety of sort of exploitative arrangements that aren't going to show up on what Lugones calls the light side of gender, or the light side of economics, if you will. And I mean, I'm strongly inclined to think that in sort of the interbound system of trans sex work that I just outlined, that really what we see here is sort of something that ought to be analyzed, not in terms of wage labor, but sort of on what Lugones would call the dark side of gender, right? And in a sense, very much a continuation of sort of a colonial imposition of sorts. So, I mean, that's specifically where I would go with regard to what I was talking about today.
Thank you. So, Manuel, if you have something else to add, you can put it on the chat. Oh, wait. I wanted to mention something about sex work. So one of the things, I'm not sure how it works in the US, but I would imagine that you can change your name legally in the US, right? Like if you are a trans person or if you just want to change it because you want to. But in Peru, you cannot. So like if you're a trans woman, you cannot change legally your name.
Mhm.
So whenever you want to open a bank account or whenever you want to do anything and they ask for the national ID, then you would have your previous male name. So in Peru, for instance, that's one of the main problems that trans women have to get jobs because, you know, like you talk about reality enforcement, right? When they go to get a job and they present themselves as women, and then people say, oh, okay, I want to see your ID because that's really common here to like look at the basic information. And then they see the male name. And then, you know, they don't get the opportunity. So I wanted to ask, like, if this is also an issue in the context that you've been working and know, because like I said,
I mean, well, certainly there is, you know, the possibility of legally changing your name, but it costs money.
okay.
And you may not have access to the resources. You may not know about it. Like, I mean, certainly, you know, I mean, if you transition informally and you're engaged in sex work, right? Going off to like change your documents is not something that is going to happen, right? Even if it is something that you can do. And so this may be, I mean, I think that this is possibly an important difference, certainly in California, because this also depends upon what state you're in the US. This may be an important difference, say, between California and Peru. Although, as I say, informally, it can sometimes come to the same thing because you don't have informal access. But I want to add, certainly, I mean, not having your documentation in order can be one reason in which you're having a hard time finding, you know, employment, but it's hardly the only one, right? I mean, so first of all, as I said before, right, depending upon the educational background that you have, the sort of the educational resources that you've been permitted to access, is going to you know, place constraints on what kind of job you can get or not. That's one thing. And two, right, even if you have the right ID, it does not mean that you won't get harassed in the work environment, right? I know tons of, you know, trans folks who like were out as trans either because they couldn't pass or because they just simply came out as trans, were then subject to all this kind of like nonsense while they were working. It became a very, you know, unpleasant space. And so I think that this is an interesting detail, an important detail, but I think that I don't know that it actually changes much in terms of the overall system.
I see. So for instance, here, I interviewed this trans woman and she was able to go to university. So, because in Peru, well, you know that I've interviewed some trans women. There's
I know, yeah.
So many of them start transitioning when they finish high school. So usually they finish high school, they start transitioning, they get kicked out of their houses, and then they go to the streets. But this particular woman, she started transitioning while she was in university. So what happened to her, for instance, is that even though she finished all the classes, she couldn't get her degree because it had her male name, right? So even though she studied and she's a lawyer, she cannot practice like a lawyer because she doesn't have a degree, because she doesn't want a degree with a male name, right? So like many of the things that I've talked to them, for instance, during COVID in Peru, there was a time for more than 100 days that we were under lockdown. And if you went out, they would look at your national ID, like whenever the policeman wanted to, because you can only go out for special needs. And, you know, like every time they go out, they fear that someone will ask for their ID and then the transphobic violence will start. That's why I was asking you about this specific thing. Like in Peru, I think it's very, like very central to their experience. Or if they want to get vaccinated, then they see, oh, male name. Like every time they want to do something, then they have this obstacle that they are treated like males because they have a male name on their ID. So that's why
Right.
I was,
No, I mean, and I want to sort of like, hear and receive and register what you're saying. And I got to say, like, just sort of like, we'll share this. Not all of my identity documents are in line with my identity. And I know what it's like to travel in fear. And so, I mean, I'm certainly not the only trans person in the US for whom that is an issue. And I certainly hear you that this is sort of an additional issue in terms of the access to, like, the diploma, a degree, and employment opportunities. And that may be right on the agenda right now as the most important thing in Peru. All I would say is, it's not going to solve all the problems, because there's still going to be employment discrimination. There's still going to be transphobia. There's still going to be all this. And I certainly would say that even if this is and rightfully so, an important issue, it just seems to me that, like, if you could magically solve that problem with ID right now, right? That's not going to solve all the problems. It's not going to, like, as it were, eliminate coerced trans-sex work, right? That's not going to go away. I mean, because there's other, in terms of, like, sex work, you need to think about other things, like, pervasive societal devaluing that you internalize, right, can lead, as I said before, to, like, substance use, right? There's all sorts of factors. Sorry.
No, yeah, that's
What
right.
am I saying making sense? Like, I agree with you. I just think that there's more. That's all.
No, yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that because here it's illegal. And so I wasn't really aware of how it was in the US. But yeah, you're completely right. There are so many other factors and consequences. And yeah, so thank you. So we have a comment from Veronica Clemente. She asked a question previously. And so she says, and the same with respect to sex work, xerophobia is found as an extra limitation to be able to find housing, work, and even comprehensive health, being treated as a gay man, reinforcing this mandate of intimacy and genitalia by the paradigms of HIV in public health care centers. Yeah, so I think she wanted to, like, comment that, building on what we've said.
Right. But what she was saying is right. I just want to sort of, like, say this back. It seems like in Peru, that even when it comes to, like, like HIV prevention services and things like that, there's no distinct program for trans women. Is that right? And that you would just be assimilated into, like, men who have sex with men.
No, I think that to get HIV medicine, yes, there is a difference from trans women, but only trans women, not for trans men, for example.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's also, like, the number of trans women that are sexual workers and have HIV, it's pretty high up, like 80%.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I do believe that it's worldwide.
Yeah. Do you think the same happens? Like, the numbers are so high in countries like the US?
Yeah. They're very high in the US still. I'll go and I'll get this. I don't know if they're as high as that, but I know that they're high.
Right.
But I think that it will matter in terms of racial demographic as well. Right.
Yeah, that's the same. Yeah.
The fact is, like, in the US, just like, you can bet on it that it's Black trans women who are mostly vulnerable to all species of, like, horrible things. It's just, so you think about, HIV, like, seroprevalence, if you think about vulnerability to violence, if you think about vulnerability, all of these things. And to me, it's like little surprise that in the United States, that was sort of built on anti-Black racism, that would be the case. So.
Right. Yeah, I think here something similar happens, not specifically with the population, but yeah, in terms of race. But I wanna ask one more question. This is from Susana Rice. So she's asking whether if you could like share some light into lesbian trans women. Yeah, like in regards to what you've said and your analysis.
Well, I mean, I'll sort of say like, I don't know if you mean about like with regard to sex work, with regard to the calamities of intimacy. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned earlier, and sort of like, when I was in a relationship with a lesbian identified non-trans woman, we went through this whole thing where she wasn't accepted and I wasn't accepted by her friends. So her own
yeah, she's saying that she doesn't mean sex workers, just like lesbian trans women.
I mean, so I think that lesbian trans women are vulnerable to relational foreclosure just as much as trans women. I mean, certainly my experience in the US, in California, has been that trans women tend not to be accepted in many lesbian communities, whereas trans men are, which is interesting. You can have a lesbian who is dating a trans guy, but trans women are not as readily accepted. That's what and I think that it's changed. I mean, it was far more prevalent back in the aughts. And so I think it's changing, but I do think that that's still the case. And I don't know if this answers this person's question.
Yeah, she was just asking if you could expand on the experience of trans women that are lesbians, maybe because you have not mentioned them as much during your talk. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So if anyone has another question, we have 7 minutes, because I know we're all, well, I am super, super excited and have a lot of energy, but I can imagine, Talia, you're super exhausted.
I'm tuckered out, but I will say this, because I feel badly about how I rushed it, I am going to come back next time and talk more about trans sex work. Hopefully people won't mind, but I think that people wanted to talk about that. Just, it will give some kind of continuity and overlap, much in the same way that I revisited the basics of reality enforcement earlier today. Right,
right. And also you can use a little bit more time for the presentation.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I guess, well, a couple of people are saying thank you so much. Thanks for the presentation. I guess before, okay, thank you so much. But I think that before we go, I just wanna ask something else. So one of the things that I wanted to ask is that, for instance, like in Peru, well, so a lot of people are saying goodbye. And thank you.
Bye. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, Naomi saying I always learn so much from you, Talia, thanks. And like a lot of people are saying thank you very much, great talk. You are allowing us to have a deeper understanding. Yeah, a lot of people are saying thank you so much. I think this, yeah, very new for everyone. So before people leave, I just want to say that we have the third and last talk next week, which is September 29th, if I'm not mistaken. And it's going to be on Thursday at 6 p.m. again. If you want to listen to the conference in Spanish, you can do it if you come onto the Zoom platform. If not, you can also listen to the talk on our fan page on Facebook. So we're gonna have Talia also next week. She's gonna be here for the 3rd week in a row. So we're extremely honored, privileged, happy, and extremely excited to be able to share all these 3 sessions with her. And just so all of you know, the next session is called, I'm sorry, here it is. Okay, so the next conference is called Rethinking Trans Politics, Rethinking Trans Theory. So you are all welcome next week. I'm gonna put in the chat our website so you can subscribe for the next session, but it's the same link. So if you already subscribed and have the link for the Zoom platform, then it's the same. Yeah, so yeah, a lot of people are still saying, yeah, yeah, so there's a lot of people that are saying, thank you for the presentation, I've learned a lot, thank you very much, great. And yeah, so there's a lot of people that are saying thank you very much. Yeah, so I guess thank you everyone. Thank you, Talia. And we can stop with the webcasting and see you next Thursday.